Hi folks. It's been a while since I've done one of these basic setup tutorial videos because I haven't really updated the firmware in a while. There have been some significant changes to the Virpil setup software, and it's probably worth going through this again in the hope that it helps you get through this process without screwing stuff up. So, warning 1. It is best to only have one Virpil device connected at a time if you're doing initial setup. So if you just bought some nice new shiny kit and you've got a couple of different joysticks or a throttle and a joystick, when you're doing this, only have one plugged in at a time. So right now, I'm going to be going through throttle setup. So I've got my throttle plugged into the USB port that normally gets plugged into it, and I've unplugged the joystick. The software used to give you a warning message whenever you had more than one device connected. It doesn't seem to do that anymore, so it's not great. So that's the first one. Only have one device plugged in when you're going to do setup. The next sort of warning I'll have to give you is that, well, I'll show you in the current software. So this is the current software I have running as admin. Current software stroke firmware I have on my device at the moment. Go to the profile tab. So here it is. It's a VPC throttle MT50, and this part here is telling me the firmware revision. Now I'm on the profile tab, and if I go over to this point here, this is the USB identifier. It's made up of 3 components. The USB string name, which is what your device manager will show. And then these 2 other things here. This is the VID, vendor identifier, and the PID, the peripheral identifier. These 2 things here is how Windows identifies different devices. So right now this is 03EB and 2055. Why am I bringing this up now? Because this is what they're currently set at. So if I'm updating the firmware, unfortunately, the newer firmware and software is going to change these to different values. Now, this becomes a problem because most games, example DCS for example, so if you've 30 planes already in DCS and you've been using your hardware for a while and you've set all your planes up using your throttle and your joystick, for my throttle 03EB2055 is the identifier it uses for that throttle. If I update to the new firmware and it changes this, I now have 30 planes to have to rebind. And that's going to kind of suck a bit. So I don't know why they've done this, but they've done it again. They used to do it in the past, way back in 2017-18, and then they stopped doing it. And for some reason in the newer firmwares, they've gone to changing the VID, PIDs. So you just need to be aware of that. There is a way of changing it back, mind you. I'll show you that later on. So I've given you the warning, so let's kick things off. Today I'm using 2020 December 11th version. So this is the identifier I've created for this shortcut, so there's no which version's which. Run as administrator. And here is our throttle. That is showing up. My send version not supported, so I probably mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. The version of the software comes with a version of firmware that works with it. So the 2 basically have to match. So I have new software but old firmware, so it's not going to play ball. So the first thing what I have to do is update the firmware. Now there is one thing to note here, and this is a good thing. The newer software seems clever enough to, whenever it connects to a device for the first time, even though the version's not supported, it can seem to work out what the device is. So I can see that this is a Mongoose version 1 throttle, and it's set to the no mode modifier profile. So that's kind of neat. But I'll go through the full setup just to make sure that you've got all the information available. So go down to firmware, make sure it's pointing at the right file, which it is, and then start the firmware update. So that's the first step done. Now I'm just going to go through this regardless, even though I don't really have to. So normally what you do next is set your profile up. So you have two choices here. I use the no mode modifier one because it gives me more flexibility with using joystick gremlin. And then I'm going to save VPC device. So that's just making sure. If you have a brand new device, it might not have a config on it. So this is just showing you the fail-safe method of doing it. Okay, so that's your profile setup. Okay, so the next thing to do, now that we've put the new firmware on the device and we set the profile up to basically tell the device what it is. That's what basically the profile setting is. The microcontrollers on these boards, the firmware is the same for them all, regardless if it's a base or a joystick. So it needs to be told what it is. And that's what setting up the profile basically does. It says, look, mate, you're a throttle and you're using the no mode modifier profile. That's how to operate. Okay. So next step up is calibration. So what is calibration? You're basically telling the device, look, I am going to switch into calibration mode. I want you to monitor the axes. I'm going to move the axes, analog axes, through their full range of motion. And I want you to work out what the maximum, minimum, and if applicable, what the center location is. So there are two types of analog axes. The first type is a no center position ones. And they are, for example, the throttle arms or any of the standard lever off to the right hand side. And the other type is the center position ones, or with center. An example of that would be the mini stick, because it has a center position where you're not moving it, where it's idle, it's at rest, your finger's not on it. And the little scroll type wheel that is on the left hand throttle, the right hand throttle, that has a center detent position. So you move it down, you roll it back, and then there's a center position where it kind of just rests, sort of like a little notch. So those are the two types of axes. So let's begin. Go down to calibrate axes. And I'm going to start off, I've unlocked the throttle handle lock lever so that the left and right throttle can move independently. I'm going to move the left throttle all the way forward, all the way back, do it twice, and then leave it at 0 all the way back. And then the right throttle. Next, the little lever off to the right hand side of the throttle, all the way forward, all the way back a couple of times. And then I'm going to work through the other axes that I have. Now on my joystick, there's two little dials, and then the thumb like scroll type thing. I use that for zoom. So that has a detent, so I leave it in the detent position and then do the other analog axes. They also have detents, so all the way forward, all the way back, all the way forward, all the way back. Do it a couple of times and leave it in the center. Now, if you happen to have one of the CMs or CM2s that have the analog mini stick, now is the time to move it. So move it to the left, move it to the right, move it forward, move it back, and then go and do the diagonals. So that's top left, bottom right. Do all 4 diagonals as well. And then take your hand off the stick, leave it to settle, and then save calibration to profile. And I can move the axes around and you can see they're showing the right values correctly. So that is the basic configuration and setup done for this particular device. So we've done the basic configuration and setup. Now there's something we should do next before we do anything else. Okay, so make sure you've got the current profile loaded into the software, because that's how this works. You load the profile from the physical device into the software, you make changes in the software, and then you click the save VPC device to send them back. So I've just loaded the config from the throttle into this software. So I'm going to go to profile, and I'm going to go to export, and I've created a folder here with the version, and I'll just overwrite this one. So I'm going to call it, so it says V1 throttle basic setup. So this is the basic out of the box setup, and it now uses an XML format, which means that, I'll save that. So the using the XML format basically means that if you set a device up, update the firmware later on, you can import your original configuration now into the device without having to go through your calibration stages or your profile stages once you update the firmware. So that's going to make life a lot easier for people. So that it's worth doing the basic setup and then exporting that out to an XML file, because if you start playing around in the software now and you cock something up, you can just use the import, open it, and then save VPC device, and that will have your device exactly the way you first initially set it up. So if you're going to be playing with the software and trying weird and wacky new stuff, it's probably worth exporting your original just basic setup config first, and then if you cock something up, it's very quick to fix. Okay, I'm going to run through something here which may or may not be useful to you. It's entirely optional if you want to do this or not. Some people may need to do it, and I'll just go through it now. I mentioned earlier on that the VID and PID in this particular release of software has been changed for some unknown reason. This could cause a problem with some games, because games use these identifiers here to determine the ID of the joystick. And if you, for example, in DCS have set up 30 aircraft with the IDs that were previously used, and you now put the new firmware on and they've changed, you've got 30 aircraft you're going to have a problem with. The secondary use for this is, for example, if you're using a Virpil base with a, for example, Warthog like A10 or F18 grip, the target software that you can use to do funky stuff with the Thrustmaster gear, it'll be looking for specific IDs here for these vendor VID and PIDs, and also the string. So this is how to basically change this. Now the original string I was using, or it was using, it was O3EB, I think. Let me just check. Yep, O3EB and 2055. The name hasn't changed, so we'll just leave that as is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send that back to the device. And this will change this identifier here. And there you go. If you're using Warthog stuff, you'll need to look up online whatever the PIDs, VIDs, and name strings are to set them up. But that's basically how to change the PID and VID for a Virpil device. I'm just going to run through some of the tweaks that I do on my own setup. This may or may not be applicable to you. So I'll just run through it anyway. First thing is the toggle switches. There are two on my device. There are two two-way toggle switches, which basically means there's no center idle position. So they're either forward or backward. So either pressing one button or pressing another. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this one here, number 28. Because 28 and 29, you can see, I'll just set button stats. 28 and 29 correspond to, on my device, toggle 2. So I'm going to change it from switch to toggle on, which basically means if it gets pressed, it'll press a button momentarily and then release it. And then I got to go down to the first spare one I see. Okay, that's 28. So the pair on that one's 29. Change that to 29. And then go toggle on and save. And I'm going to do the same for the other toggle switch. So 30. Change to toggle on. And then the other pair to that one is 31. Right. Okay. Now save VPC device. So let's load up a VPC joy tester. Bring her over. Select it on the list and start streaming data. So, the reason why I've changed those toggles to toggle on, what it basically means is each time I move the toggle to either position, it will fire a pulse, but only for like a couple of hundred milliseconds and then go off. So that's me toggling toggle 1 backward and forward. So the other mode I could use it in is normal mode, but that will mean that the button will be permanently held. And there's toggle 3. So you can see it just fires a brief pulse for the change. So that's the way I use them. Next thing I change on my setup is the encoder dials. I set them to encoder dial buffered. These encoders are 12 step per rotation, and there's 3 of them. So that's why there's 6 here listed. People get freaked out because they're going like, oh, I'm moving my encoder and it's triggering 2 buttons. It does that, but what I'll show you is the important difference here between what you see internally, because that's what this utility shows, and then what gets sent to Windows. So I'm going to go to my E1 encoder wheel. And I'm turning it clockwise. So you can see there, you're getting 60 and 61 trigger, and people are going like, oh, why is this freaking out? Chill out, dude. It's the way encoders work. If you show the joy tester, this shows you what's actually getting sent to Windows. So I'm doing the same thing again. I'm doing it clockwise, and it's just triggering 45 because that's what it's bound to. And if I do anti-clockwise, counterclockwise for you Americans, it's triggering button 44. So that's how that's what this VPC Joy tester shows you what's going to Windows. And this shows you internal stuff. So don't freak out if you move your encoder and it's triggering two things. It's just the way they work, man. Okay. And this 57 is the actual big mode dial. So that's why it's permanently active. It's got one position. That just resets the status. So yeah, there's the basic button tweaks I use. Next, I'm going to do the axis tweaks I use. And I use this for specifically for the F18 and DCS to move the analog throttles out of the idle position. So here we go. Axis number 1. Range 1% to 2%. And then button 1 to 8, because I always count backwards. And then axis 2, 1%, 2%, and then 1 to 7. So what does this mean? When the axis, that's the throttle handles, axis 1 and 2, that's left and right, are all the way back, and then nothing's going to happen. As soon as I go between 1 and 2%, it's going to basically trigger a virtual button. And what I do is go to the button tab. And add a binding for 128 and 127. And then save. Okay, so my throttle handles are all the way back at 0. You see it yourself, that was the left one trigger. Just briefly flipped on for a second as I went through. Set at 5%. And then move the right handle. And it blipped again. And if I go to the joy tester again, select our device, and you can see it did the same thing. So these logical buttons is what Windows sees. It's what Windows gets sent. And these ones here are the internal ones, internal to the firmware that's running on the device. And this table here is the mapping table that maps the two together so as you can configure and change things. Now some people are like, oh, why isn't button 1 like button 1 and stuff? And I can kind of get the logic behind wanting to change them. But if you change all these buttons and there's 60 something of them, that's going to be a major pain in the arse to do. I'd recommend against not doing it. So those are the basic tweaks that I set up on my own Virpil throttle. I just changed the encoders to buffered, that way there it won't miss any clicks. And I set the two-way toggles to toggle on mode. And that means that I find they're a wee bit more useful for what I tend to use them for. It's entirely up to you what you want to do with them. So there you go. I hope this helps.